Why are you writing that down when it's already on your phone? Why are you standing in a store trying something on when you could order 3 sizes and send 2 back? Why do you still remember the phone number of a house you have not lived in since 1998, but have to check your own number before giving it to someone? None of these things feels especially generational when you are doing them. They just feel normal. But there is a name people sometimes use for the generation caught in this exact in-between: Xennials. It's usually used for people born around the late 1970s and early 1980s, right on the boundary between Gen X and Millennials. You can think the label is silly and still recognize the pattern behind it. You grew up during a narrow window when ordinary life changed its operating rules while you were already old enough to notice. You learned one way first, adapted to another later, and kept pieces of both. And the strange part is that the evidence is not hiding in some personality test. It's sitting in the tiny things you do every day without ever wondering where they came from. One of these, the one about your brain still mapping out a town that hasn't existed for 20 years, might be the strangest thing on this list. But let's start with something you're doing right now, probably without realizing it. You still reach for a pen. You can type a note in 3 seconds. You have reminders, calendars, cloud documents, probably 3 different apps that can organize your life better than any notebook ever could. And yet there are certain things you still write down. A list before leaving the house. A phone number someone gives you while you are talking. Something important you absolutely cannot forget. The funny part is that handwriting often feels more serious, more committed. There is actually research behind that feeling. Princeton psychologist Pam Mueller and UCLA's Daniel Oppenheimer had students take notes either by hand or on a laptop, then tested what stuck. The laptop group typed more words, but the handwriting group understood and retained more, because writing slower forces your brain to process the idea instead of just copying it down. Digital is faster, your hand still sometimes wants proof that your brain was there when the thought happened. Then there is shopping, where the contradiction becomes even more obvious. You love ordering things online: toothpaste, cables, books. Half the household, probably. But some things still need to pass what you might call the hand test. Shoes, a jacket, a sofa. Something in you wants to touch it first. You want to know what the fabric feels like, whether the chair is actually comfortable, whether the size on the label has any relationship to a human body. Xennials learned shopping when buying meant inspection. You picked things up, tried them on. If you made the wrong choice, returning it meant driving back across town with a receipt you hoped you had not lost. So yes, one-click ordering is brilliant, but part of you still thinks buying something you have never actually seen is a tiny act of faith. And this is where modern convenience starts getting funny. Sometimes the supposedly easier version makes you miss the old one. You want pizza. In 1997, this was a phone call. Today, you may open an app, sign in, reset a password, and watch a tiny car crawl across a map before it arrives. At some point, a Xennial brain quietly asks, "Could I just call them?" This is not resistance to technology. Xennials embraced convenience early. You just remember when convenience meant fewer steps. And if that contradiction feels familiar, the next one is harder to blame on technology because it followed you somewhere much more personal: relationships. You understand dating apps. You may have used them. You probably know couples who met online and have been together for years, and still, some part of your brain likes the old story better. We met at work. A friend introduced us. We kept seeing each other at the same coffee shop. Xennials came of age when romance still depended heavily on physical coincidence. You could like someone without first knowing their job title, music taste, and political opinions. There was uncertainty. You had to discover the person in the wrong order. Maybe that is why a random meeting can still feel slightly more romantic than 2 algorithms deciding your faces belong next to each other. Another giveaway appears when absolutely nothing is happening. You can wait 10 minutes without treating it like an emergency. A doctor's waiting room, a station platform, the passenger seat while someone runs into a shop. You may check your phone, of course you do, but you also remember a time when there was no phone to check. You stared at the wall, read the same poster 6 times, watched people, thought about absolutely nothing useful. You got bored and remained bored, which sounds almost absurd now that every empty second can be filled instantly. Xennials spent enough childhood with unavoidable dead time that part of your brain still knows how to sit in a gap without panicking. And strangely, that may be one of the few old skills that becomes more valuable as everything gets faster. Entertainment is another place where your childhood rules were completely different. A show came on Thursday at 8. That was when you watched it or you missed it and spent the week dodging the person who couldn't wait to tell you what happened. Music worked the same way. A song came on the radio and you either heard it or you did not. There was something strangely communal about having less control. Now everything waits for you. Xennials love that freedom, but you still remember when culture had an appointment time. Then there's the information your brain simply refuses to delete. Your childhood phone number. The route to a friend's house you haven't visited in 20 years. Your locker combination from school. An old address. A jingle from a commercial that stopped airing before some of your coworkers were born. None of this is currently useful. Your brain just keeps it. Meanwhile, someone asks for your Wi-Fi password and suddenly you are staring into the middle distance like you have been asked to recite the nuclear launch codes. There's a reason this feels so Xennial. You grew up when remembering information yourself often mattered. Phones didn't store everything. Search didn't instantly recover everything. Your memory had jobs that technology later took over. Neuroscientist Eleanor Maguire at University College London actually measured this kind of memory. She scanned the brains of London taxi drivers who had spent years memorizing the city's streets by heart, no GPS, and found their hippocampus, the brain region tied to spatial memory, was physically larger than in people who had not done that work. Root memory wasn't just a mental habit. It reshaped the brain that held it. Apparently nobody told your old employees they could retire. And this is where the list gets oddly personal, because your memory doesn't just keep old information. It keeps old versions of the world. Half your town still exists as what used to be there. Someone gives you directions and says, it is next to the pharmacy. You think, right, where the Blockbuster used to be. The Blockbuster has been gone for 20 years. It doesn't matter. That location is permanently Blockbuster. A new restaurant opens and you still know the building as the old bank. Your map doesn't update by deleting the old layer. It just keeps stacking new ones on top. Sometimes you're not remembering a place. You are remembering every version of yourself who stood there. And that leads to the biggest Xennial giveaway of all. You can live completely in the modern world while quietly keeping an older version in reserve. You stream music, but understand why somebody still wants the album. You order online, but sometimes want to touch the thing first. You love instant answers, but remember wondering about something all afternoon because there was no way to look it up until you got home. You can use every modern tool perfectly well. You just remember the version of life that existed before the tool became necessary. Xennials were not simply born before the internet. You were old enough to build habits before it became the default, then young enough to rebuild those habits when everything changed. That's why so many little contradictions live comfortably in the same person. You can miss the old way without wanting it back. You can love the new way without completely trusting it. You can remember life before constant connection and still reach for your phone 50 times a day. Maybe being Xennial is less about the year on your birth certificate and more about recognizing both versions of ordinary life, because both of them still feel familiar. So if you wrote something down today, bought something online after inspecting it in person, remembered a building by what disappeared from it 20 years ago, or caught yourself thinking, this used to be easier, you may be more Xennial than you think. Which one gave you away?